My name is Dale Kowalski. I'm 68 years old. I've got one good knee and about 3 years left before my heart quits, if the doctor's math is right. And I've been carrying something for 31 years that I never told another living soul. Not my daughter, not my brother. Not the VA therapist I saw for 6 months in 1998 who kept telling me that what was wrong with me was the war. She wasn't wrong, but she also wasn't right. What I'm about to tell you happened in the spring of 1994, deep in the Ocala National Forest, Central Florida. 430,000 acres of longleaf pine, cypress swamps, black water creeks, and sand scrub that goes on long enough to make you forget the rest of the world exists. The Forest Service estimates about 250 miles of hiking trails. I can tell you, from personal experience, that there are parts of that forest that haven't seen a human boot print in decades, maybe longer. I know, because I spent 8 days tracking something through it. Something that wasn't a bear. Something that wasn't a man. And on the 8th day, when I finally had it cornered against a limestone bluff in a bend of the Juniper Run, it turned around and looked at me. Full, deliberate. Not the panicked pivot of a frightened animal, a choice. It turned around because it decided to, and what it said, I still wake up at 3 in the morning with those words sitting in my chest like a stone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you about that bluff, before I tell you about the 8 days, I need to tell you about who I was when this started. Because what you are shapes what you see. And what you've done shapes how long the truth stays buried inside you. I did 2 tours in Ranger Regiment. 75th, out of Hunter Army Airfield, Savannah. First tour was 79 through 81. Second was 83 through 86. I won't go into specifics on operations. There are things still classified, and there are things I just don't revisit. What I will tell you is that Ranger training strips something out of you and replaces it with a different kind of operating system. You stop reacting. You start reading. The forest, the terrain, the patterns, what belongs and what doesn't. You learn to track movement through undergrowth the way a musician reads sheet music. It stops being analysis and becomes instinct. When I came back from my second tour, I was 30 years old and I felt 60. I had a wife, Lisa, who'd waited as long as she was able, and a daughter, Claire, who was 3 years old and didn't know me well enough yet to miss me when I was gone. I tried. I want to be honest with you about that. I genuinely tried to be the man they needed. I got a job with the Florida Forest Service doing prescribed burn management. That kept me outdoors, kept me on a schedule, kept me tired in the right ways. But I was a lousy husband. Not violent, not cruel, just absent. There's a kind of man who comes back from war, and his body is in the room, but the important parts of him are somewhere on a hillside 9,000 miles away, running the same 30 seconds over and over again. That was me. Lisa filed in 1990. The divorce was quiet and sad and completely fair. Claire was 9. She stayed with her mother, which was right. I put in for a transfer to the Ocala district the same month the divorce was finalized. I wanted trees, and I wanted solitude, and I wanted a job that used the skills I actually had without asking me to talk about my feelings, or attend departmental meetings or care about property taxes. I got a district ranger posting covering the northeastern quadrant of Ocala, roughly 47,000 acres of mixed longleaf wiregrass flatwoods, scrub oak, and riverine swamp along the Alexander Springs corridor. Population of the nearest town, Salt Springs, was maybe 800 people if you counted the part-timers who came down for the weekend fishing. My cabin was on Forest Service land, 8 miles from the district office, 12 miles from the nearest gas station. That suited me perfectly. I had 3 years in that posting before the spring of 1994, and I'd learned that forest the way you learn anything important. Slowly, through repetition, by paying attention to the things that don't add up. I knew every trail, most of the off-trail deer paths, the locations of the active gopher-tortoise colonies, the cypress heads where the wood storks nested, the stretch of Juniper Run where the otters had a den under a fallen cypress log that they'd been using for at least 2 seasons. I knew what belonged in that forest, which is why, when something that didn't belong started leaving signs, I noticed. Before I go any further with this, I want to say something directly to whoever's listening. I know how this sounds. I'm 68 years old, I'm alone, my health is bad, and I'm uploading videos to the internet. My daughter Claire set this up for me. She says I need something called subscribers, or nobody will ever hear this. And I told her I didn't entirely care if nobody heard it. I just needed to say it out loud before I couldn't anymore. She says that's not how YouTube works. She's probably right, she usually is. So if you're willing to hear the rest of this, and I understand completely if you're not, hit that subscribe button. Claire will be pleased, and at my age, pleasing my daughter is about the only metric I still score points on. I'm not here to scare you. I'm not here to entertain you, though I hope it's interesting. I'm here because for 31 years I've been sitting on something that I believe deserves a witness. And running out of time has a way of clarifying your priorities. Back to 1994. The first sign came in February. A set of tracks in a soft sand fire break on the eastern edge of my patrol area, near the forest boundary with private timberland. I almost missed them. The soil had dried and the definition was starting to go. But something made me stop the truck and get out. They were bipedal. I want you to understand what that means in context. Bipedal tracks in soft sand in a Florida scrubland, spaced at approximately 4 feet between heel strikes. That spacing tells you stride length, which tells you height and weight. These were not human tracks. The foot structure was wrong. Longer across the midfoot, the toe spread wider, the heel compressed differently. The depth of impression in dry sand told me something between 300 and 500 pounds, and the stride length, 4 feet, meant whatever left these was moving at a casual walking pace and stood somewhere between 7 and 9 feet tall. I stood there for a long time looking at those tracks. I took photographs. I measured. I wrote in my field log, unknown bipedal, not bear, not human. Query with FWC. I called Florida Fish and Wildlife and described what I'd found without speculating. The officer I spoke to was polite and professionally skeptical. He suggested I'd found bear tracks, possibly misread due to substrate distortion. I did not argue. I've been in situations where arguing your assessment to someone who's decided they already know the answer is a waste of breath. But I went back the next day and the day after. The tracks didn't repeat in the same location, but over the next 6 weeks I found 3 more sets, always in soft substrate, sand, creek mud, the edges of cypress domes after rain. Always bipedal. Always that same impossible stride. Whatever was out there, it was ranging across a large area, moving parallel to the main trail corridors but never on them, staying in the heaviest cover. And it was doing this at night, based on the dew press in the substrate each morning. I started a dedicated log, separate from my official field notes, just for this. By April, I'd mapped 9 separate track sites. When I laid them out on the topo map pinned to my cabin wall, a pattern emerged that made the back of my neck go cold. The tracks formed a loose circuit around the northeastern quadrant. A territory. Whatever this was, it wasn't passing through. It lived here. I want to stop here and tell you what I was thinking. Because I know what you're probably thinking. You're thinking, ex-military man, isolated posting, history of trauma, starts seeing things that aren't there. That's a reasonable thing to think. I thought it myself. I actually took a week off in March and drove down to Gainesville and had a physical and told my doctor I was experiencing some cognitive unusual stuff and asked to be evaluated. She ran me through the standard screens, found nothing remarkable, told me I was a little depressed and a little sleep-deprived but fundamentally sound. I drove back to Ocala and kept the log. By the first week of April, I'd found something else. Kills. Not the scattershot predation pattern of a large cat. Florida panther, which I'd documented before. Not the bone crush evidence of a bear feeding. Something different. The carcasses I found, 3 white-tailed deer over a 2-week period, were disarticulated with a precision that didn't match any predator I'd trained to identify. The long bones had been split, deliberately, in a way that required both the grip strength to hold the bone and the leverage understanding to snap it at the right angle. The marrow had been extracted, cleanly, like something knew exactly what it was doing. I photographed all 3. I wrote in my separate log, not random predation, methodical. Suggests planning capacity. That's when I made the decision. Not the tracking decision, that came later. At this point, I decided I was going to find out what this was, officially, as part of my job. I submitted a formal unusual species observation report to the district office and requested authorization to conduct targeted surveillance in the northeastern quadrant over a 60-day period, citing the track evidence and the anomalous predation pattern. My supervisor, a good man named Dale Whitfield, called me into the office and asked me what I thought I was dealing with. I told him the truth. I said I didn't know. He authorized the surveillance, gave me 2 trail cameras from the equipment pool, told me not to put them anywhere near the public trail corridors, and told me to keep it quiet until I had something definitive. I drove home and started planning. I set the first trail camera on April 14, 1994. A Tuesday. I know the exact date because I noted it in the official log, and also because of what the camera captured 4 days later, which I will get to. I positioned the cameras based on the track pattern. One at a choke point between a cypress dome and a scrub oak ridge that everything large in that sector passed through eventually, and one at the creek crossing on a Blackwater tributary of the Alexander Run, where I'd found the highest concentration of tracks. On April 18th, I drove out before dawn to check the first camera. The camera was still mounted. The housing was intact. The motion sensor light was off, which meant the memory card was full, or the battery was dead. The battery was a fresh Duracell I'd installed 4 days earlier. It was completely drained. Stone dead. The memory card had 47 images on it. The first 39 were normal. Deer, hog, a raccoon, a bobcat at 2:17 a.m. The 40th image was time-stamped 3:43 a.m. on April 16th. It showed a shape. Just the lower half of a shape, because the camera angle was set for deer height, about 30 inches off the ground. What the frame captured was 2 legs, upright, covered in dark brown fur. The feet were large and clawed. The stride caught mid-step suggested the figure was moving at a calm walk, not fleeing. The 41st image was from 3:43:07 a.m., 7 seconds later. The camera was facing slightly downward. Something had repositioned it. Looking directly into the lens was a face. I have to stop here for a moment, because describing what I saw in that photograph is something I've avoided doing out loud for 31 years, and now that I'm doing it, I need to be precise. The face was canine in structure, wide-set, elongated snout, heavy jaw, fur across the cheeks and forehead, darkening to near black around the eyes. The ears were high and pointed, aimed directly at the camera. The jaw was slightly parted, showing the lower teeth. But the eyes were not animal eyes. I've looked into the eyes of wolves, Florida panthers, black bears, alligators, every large predator in this state. I know what animal eyes look like behind a camera flash. They go flat, reflective. The intelligence isn't there. The reaction is, the wariness, the evaluation, but not the intelligence. These eyes were evaluating the camera, not reacting to the motion trigger, not startled by the flash, looking at the camera the way you or I would look at an object we were trying to figure out. There was something behind those eyes that knew what the camera was and was deciding what to do about it. The 40-second image was from 3:43:15 a.m. The camera was back in its original position. Whatever had picked it up and looked into it had set it back down. Precisely. The composition was almost identical to the original mount. The 43rd through 47th images were empty. Motion trigger, nothing visible. Whatever it was had moved out of frame. The camera battery was dead. I sat in my truck for 45 minutes before I drove back to the cabin. I want to be precise about what I decided next and why, because the decision matters. A rational person, let's say a wildlife biologist, a scientist, someone operating purely on protocol, would have taken those images to the district office immediately, filed a formal report, brought in experts. I did not do that. I told myself it was because I didn't have enough. 47 images and a drained battery weren't definitive. I needed more. That was partly true. The fuller truth was that I'd been alone for 4 years in that forest. I'd been alone, in a real sense, since 1986. And those eyes in that photograph, the intelligence behind them, the deliberateness, did something to the loneliness that I can't entirely explain. It made the loneliness feel temporary, like something was out there that was real and present and extraordinary, and I hadn't found it yet, but I was going to. That is not a rational reason, I know that. But it's an honest one. I pulled both cameras on April 20th. I told Dale the surveillance hadn't yielded anything actionable. He moved on to other concerns. I started planning a tracking operation. Ranger School teaches you to track as a combat skill, following enemy combatants through terrain, reading movement for tactical intelligence, predicting direction and intent. What it also teaches you, if you are paying attention, is that tracking is a form of conversation. You're reading the choices something made, where it stepped and why, what it avoided, what it moved toward. Every choice tells you something about the thing that made it. I knew, going in, that whatever I was tracking was not a large animal in the conventional sense. It had repositioned a trail camera and set it back down at 3:43 in the morning. It was aware of human surveillance technology. It had a territory it was maintaining with precision, and it was ranging, based on my 9 track sites, across roughly 14,000 acres of the northeastern quadrant in a roughly 6-week circuit. I planned for 8 days. That wasn't a number I chose randomly. Based on the circuit pattern I'd mapped, I estimated that if I entered the territory at the northeastern edge and moved southwest at the pace the tracks suggested the territory was being patrolled, I would intercept the circuit somewhere around day 6 or 7. The extra day was buffer. I packed for 9, in case I was wrong. I told Dale I was taking personal leave for 10 days. I had the accumulated time. He didn't ask questions. I called Claire on the phone the night before I went in. She was 13, living with her mother in Tampa. And I told her I loved her, and that I was going camping for a week, and she said, "Dad, you live in a forest. Isn't that like always camping?" And I laughed, genuinely, for the first time in I don't know how long. I went in on May 2nd, 1994. Dawn, no camera, no radio beyond an emergency beacon. My service sidearm, which I was authorized to carry on Forest Service business. a spotting scope, a notebook, and every navigation and tracking skill 2 tours in Ranger Regiment had burned into me. Day 1 was positioning. I moved into the territory through the Cypress Dome corridor, staying in the shade of the canopy, minimizing my silhouette. I found fresh tracks within 3 hours, 2 days old, based on the dew press degradation and the insect activity in the soil displacement. The figure had passed through heading southwest. Good. I was behind it on the circuit. That was where I wanted to be. I made camp that night in a dense scrub oak stand. No fire. Cold food. I sat with my back to the largest oak I could find and listened to the forest for 4 hours before I slept. Nothing unusual. Day 2, I picked up fresher tracks, less than 12 hours old. The stride had changed slightly. Shorter, it was moving through denser terrain. I followed for 6 miles through the hottest part of the day, and then went to ground in a palmetto thicket near a small pond. That night, at approximately 11 p.m., I heard it for the first time. A vocalization. Distance. I judged it at a 1/4 mile, maybe slightly more. It started as a low resonant rumble, the kind of sound that you feel in your sternum before you register it as hearing. Then it modulated, rose in pitch, dropped, rose again. It was structured. Not a single continuous call like a wolf or a bobcat. It had internal variation, like it was composed of distinct elements strung together. I lay absolutely still in my sleeping bag and listened to it for approximately 3 minutes. Then it stopped. I wrote in my notebook, vocalization, approximately 0.3 miles NNW 2304. Structured, multiple distinct elements, not consistent with any known Florida wildlife. Duration approximately 180 seconds. Deliberate cessation, no fade, immediate stop. My hands were steady. I want you to know that. I wasn't afraid exactly. What I felt was the same precise aliveness I'd felt on patrol. Everything heightened, everything sharp, every irrelevant thought stripped away, just the information and what to do with it. Day 3. I cut the distance in half. Found a track site less than 6 hours old at a creek crossing. The mud was still settling slightly at the edges, which told me I was getting close to real time. I slowed down. A fundamental rule of tracking a sentient target. When you're close, slower is faster. Any experienced tracker or hunter will tell you that the last 20% of the distance takes 80% of the time. Move wrong at that stage and you lose days. I spent day 3 moving less than 2 miles. Listening more than walking. Reading the terrain for where something large and cautious and intelligent would feel safe. I found a bed site that afternoon, a circular area of flattened vegetation, approximately 8 feet across, under the spread of a large longleaf pine. The flattening was deliberate, not the random matting of an animal that had lain down, but a cleared area, the longer grass bent uniformly inward toward the center. At the edge of the cleared area, I found something that made me crouch down and stay crouched for a long time. A structure. Small, about 8 inches tall, maybe 12 inches wide at the base. Stacked limestone chunks, flat pieces selected for the purpose. Not random rock scatter. Someone had built this, placed each piece with intent. It wasn't a cairn exactly, too low and wide, more like a platform. On top of the highest stone was a single large alligator gar scale, iridescent in the afternoon light. Placed there intentionally. I did not touch it. I photographed it in my memory. I deliberately left cameras behind, and sitting here now I wish I hadn't, but at the time it felt important not to carry devices it could detect. I backed out of the area the way I'd come in, retracing my exact footsteps. Day 4 was surveillance. I found a position upwind of the bed site, 40 yards distant, in a thick palmetto stand, and I held position for most of the day. I was operating on the possibility that whatever used that bed was on a cycle, same rest site at certain times. I was wrong about that as it turned out, but the wait wasn't wasted. At dusk, around 7:30 p.m., I heard movement, northeast of the bed site. Heavy, slow. The unhurried movement of something that was not concerned about being heard. I had my spotting scope up. The light was going fast. What I saw, and I will be precise because precision is all I have to offer you, moved through the gap between two large pine trunks at the edge of my sight line. Upright, fully upright, moving with the fluid, slightly forward-leaning gait of something accustomed to bipedal locomotion. The fur was dark brown to black along the back, slightly lighter at the sides. The shoulders were extraordinary, wide beyond any human proportionality, the arms hanging long at the sides, the head was large. The ears, even at 40 yards, even in failing light, were pointed and high-set, moving independently as it walked. It stopped. 50 feet from the bed site, it stopped, stood absolutely still. The ears swiveled toward my position. I did not move. I did not breathe more than I had to. It stood there for 90 seconds. I counted. Then it moved, not away, not toward the bed site. It moved at a 90-degree angle, eastward, deeper into the scrub, and was gone. It had smelled me or heard something, and it had decided not to approach the bed site while I was present. It knew I was there. Day 5 was the day I understood what kind of tracking operation I was actually running. I'd been thinking about this as a wildlife observation. Find it, document it, establish what it is. Standard field methodology. On day 5, I found the first sign that I was also being tracked. I'd moved my camp 2 miles southeast the night before. Found a new position in a cabbage palm hammock near a drainage slough. In the morning, when I did my perimeter check, standard habit, 30-yard radius around the camp, looking for anything that came through in the night, I found one footprint. One, deliberately placed. On the eastern edge of my perimeter, exactly at the boundary where I'd have to look for it to find it. It was fresh, made within the last 2 to 3 hours, which meant after I'd settled for the night but before first light. It had walked up to the edge of my camp, looked at me sleeping, and left one footprint where it knew I'd find it in the morning. I sat down in the palmetto grass and I thought about that for a long time. This was communication, not a warning. There was nothing aggressive about it. The single track, the deliberate placement, it was information. I know you're here. I know where you sleep. I have chosen not to harm you. The calmness I felt sitting there was either the product of very thorough military conditioning, or I had become somewhat detached from my own survival instinct. Possibly both. I wrote in my notebook, "Subject has reversed the tracking dynamic. Aware of my position since at minimum day 3, possibly day 1. Has chosen observation over avoidance or aggression. This changes the operation. I changed the operation. Instead of tracking, I started positioning. Instead of following, I started anticipating, using the circuit map I'd built over 6 weeks of prior observation to place myself ahead of the direction of travel. Not to ambush, to be seen, to be visible, stationary and non-threatening, in a location it would have to pass through. Day 6, I positioned myself in a clearing along the Juniper Run creek bed, a natural bottleneck between 2 hammocks where the tracks had passed twice in my 6-week log. I sat in the open. Rifle. I didn't have a rifle, only my sidearm, and I holstered it and set it on the ground 6 feet to my left, visible but separated from my hands. I sat cross-legged in the sand of the creek bank, in the open, in daylight, and I waited. Nothing that day, But that night, very close, less than 100 yards, I judged, the vocalization came again. Longer this time. The structured sequence of rumbles and modulations that I'd first heard on day 2. It lasted close to 8 minutes. I sat at my camp and listened to every second of it. When it stopped, I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I cleared my throat and spoke out loud into the dark. I said, "I hear you. I'm not a threat. I'm just here to know what you are." The forest was silent for a long time. Then, from maybe 60 yards out, a single low rumble, short, contained, and then nothing. Day 7. I held my position near the Juniper Run clearing all morning. At approximately 1400 hours, moving through the tree line at the northern edge of the clearing, I saw it fully for the first time. It had come to look at me. It stood at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by the saw palmetto fronds, and it watched me. I stayed seated. I kept my hands visible. It was larger than I'd estimated from the tracks. The height was somewhere between 8 and 8.5 feet standing, and the build was massive in the specific way of something that has never been constrained by a building, a doorway, a vehicle. The fur was dark brown along the back, graying slightly at the muzzle and around the eyes, which told me, for what it was worth, that this was an older individual, an adult male in middle age or later. We looked at each other across 60 feet of open sand for a very long time. It didn't move. Neither did I. After, I'd say 20 minutes, though time was strange in that clearing, it turned and moved back into the tree line, unhurried. No threat display, no alarm, a departure. I let out a long, slow breath. Day 8. I knew from the circuit pattern that the northeastern section of the territory was next. The Juniper Run narrowed significantly about 2 miles upstream. At a limestone outcrop bend I knew well, a natural bottleneck where the water ran fast and shallow over exposed rock, and the banks on both sides were steep scrub-covered limestone. I went there before dawn. I set myself against the limestone bluff on the south bank, high ground, back against rock, able to see in all 3 directions of approach. I was not trying to trap anything. I was putting myself in a position where encounter was likely and retreat, for either of us, was deliberate rather than reactive. I want to be clear about the sidearm. It was holstered on my hip. I had no intention of using it. I had not had any intention of using it at any point in 8 days, because nothing it had done had suggested threat. But I was trained never to be unarmed in an unpredictable field situation. I had it because I always had it, not because I was planning anything. At approximately 7:30, it came down the north bank of the run, moving through the knee-high saw palmetto with the same fluid ease I'd watched the evening before, following the water line. And when it rounded the limestone bend and the creek narrowed and the banks rose steeply on both sides, it saw me. It stopped. 15 feet of fast, shallow water between us. 20 feet of open air, both banks steep behind and beside us. The limestone bluff at my back. I understand now how that configuration looked. I hadn't trapped it intentionally. The geography had done it, and I'd positioned there because I knew from the circuit map it would come through. But standing there, 15 feet away, I understood that from its perspective, it had rounded a corner and found the human who had been following it for 8 days, backed against a rock wall, with nowhere obvious to go except through or back the way it came. What it did next, what it chose to do, I have thought about almost every day for the last 31 years. It sat down, not crouched, not a threat posture. It folded itself down onto its haunches at the waterline, elbows on knees, in the way that I would later come to understand was a formalized signal in its behavioral repertoire, a statement of non-aggression. It was making itself smaller, deliberately, telling me, in the clearest body language it had, that it was not going to attack. We sat there, 6 feet of elevation difference between us, 10 feet of distance not counting the water, and looked at each other. Its eyes were amber, pale amber, almost golden in the morning light coming over the eastern bank, and they held that quality I'd first seen in the trail camera image, the quality I'd spent 2 months trying to find a word for and never had. Presence. That was the word. These were eyes with presence in them. A person was behind those eyes. Not a human person, but a person. Something that had memory and assessment and intention. Something that had followed me for 5 days and chosen, every time, not to hurt me. I took my hand very slowly and I touched my chest. Just pressed my palm flat against my sternum. "Mackay," I said. "James Mackay." The amber eyes watched me. 30 seconds of silence. The creek ran over the limestone. Then it lifted one hand. And the hand, God help me, the hand was extraordinary. Huge, fur-covered, with long, thick fingers and a thumb that opposed just like yours does, and claws that curved down from the tips like brown iron. It lifted that hand and pressed it flat against its own chest. The fur there was graying more than the back, a patch of silver just over the sternum. And it made a sound. Not a word, not quite. A sound composed of 3 distinct vocalizations, a low initial rumble, a mid-register bark that dropped at the end, and then a long resonant hum that faded on an exhale. Its name, or its title, or both. I couldn't reproduce it. I tried, in my notebook that night, to approximate it phonetically, and what I wrote was something like "Goth Rum Ha," which does no justice to what I actually heard. It was a sound built by a different vocal anatomy than mine, by a body that communicated at frequencies and textures I didn't have the equipment to replicate. But I heard it, and I said it back, poorly, imperfectly, probably humiliatingly, and the ears swiveled forward, and the amber eyes shifted in a way that I can only describe as recognition. We sat there for close to an hour. At one point it leaned forward and sniffed the air toward me. 3 long, slow inhalations, the nostrils flaring wide. I let it. Reading me, I understood. Learning my specific chemistry, my health. Whether I'd eaten recently, whether I was carrying sickness or injury. Information gathering, I had no means of reciprocating. When it had what it needed, it sat back. The posture was relaxed, and then it did something I still can't fully explain. It reached back, a long arm sweeping slowly behind it, and brought forward a bundle of something wrapped in a broad palmetto leaf, tied with a strip of bark. Set it on the bank on its side of the creek. Pushed it slowly into the shallow water, letting the current carry it a foot or so toward me. I reached into the water and picked it up. Inside the palmetto leaf was meat, cooked meat. I smelled it before I saw it, the char and fat of something that had been on a fire, not recently, but within the last day. It was white-tailed deer, I was almost certain, sliced from the hind quarter, the edges darkened. Prepared for me. It had brought me a meal. I ate it. Right there, sitting on that limestone bank, I ate the meat it had brought me. The creek ran between us. It watched. When I finished, I nodded. The way you nod at someone who's just done something kind. The ears came forward again. That same quality of recognition in the amber eyes. Then it stood, all 8.5 feet of it, unfolding from the haunches with a fluid ease that the size had no business allowing. It looked at me for a long moment, and I will tell you exactly what it said, which is the thing in this whole story that still wakes me at 3 a.m. It said, in a voice like gravel being dragged across iron, in English, broken, halting, each word dragged up from somewhere deep. It said, "You, come, far." A pause. For nothing dangerous. A pause. Careful, man. And then, quieter, the final piece, the one that still sits in my chest. I see you many times. It turned. It walked back up the north bank, through the saw palmetto, through the longleaf shadows, and it was gone. I sat against that limestone bluff for a very long time. Here's what I know about what those words meant, after 31 years of turning them over. You come far. 8 days is far, by human reckoning, but I think it was measuring something else. Not distance. Something about what it takes for a person to do what I'd done, to follow, to be patient, to make yourself visible and vulnerable, to communicate rather than confront. I think far meant that it recognized the effort as a signal, as information about my character. For nothing dangerous, I've thought about this one the most. I think this was an evaluation result. It had spent 5 days tracking me while I was tracking it, reading my behavior, my choices, my reactions. The single footprint it left at my camp perimeter. That was a test, I believe, to see what I'd do when I knew it was there. I didn't run, I didn't radio it in, I changed my approach, and from that, and everything that followed, it had concluded. This human is not hunting me. He is not here to capture or kill or expose. He is here for knowledge, and knowledge alone is not dangerous. Careful man. That one I take as a kind of compliment from a creature that did not give them carelessly. 8 days in its territory without injury or incident takes specific skills. It recognized those skills. And I see you many times, that one is simple and devastating. It had been watching me for almost the entirety of my 3 years in that district. Long before the trail cameras, long before the tracking operation. I had been observed, evaluated, cataloged, and found acceptable, long before I was aware of any of it. It had known me. For 3 years it had known me. And on day 8 of my tracking operation, when I had cornered it, or thought I had, against that limestone bluff, it had sat down and decided it was time to let me know. It chose to speak to me. That was not an accident, and it was not desperation. It was a decision made by an intelligent entity that had had 3 years to make it and had waited until the moment was right. I hiked out the next day. I didn't file any report. I drove straight to the district office, told Dale the leave had been good, and returned to my normal patrol rotation. I kept the separate log. I have it still. 2 composition notebooks, filled front to back in pencil, with the track maps and the dates and the phonetic attempt at the name and the transcript of what it said. My handwriting is not good, but it's legible. I transferred out of the Ocala district in late 1995. I put in for a desk position in the Tallahassee regional office, which anyone who knew me would have told you made no sense for a man like me. But I had a reason, and the reason was that I was afraid. Not afraid of it, afraid of myself. Afraid that if I stayed, I'd make contact again. Try to push it further. Try to find the family I was sure existed, the broader community implied by a territory that large, managed by one adult. I was afraid of what my loneliness would push me to do, and the most decent thing I could offer was to remove myself from the situation before I did it. The forest didn't need my good intentions. I'd learned that much. I retired in 2008. I've lived alone outside Chiefland since then, which is close enough to Ocala that on certain nights, when the wind is from the south, I imagine I can smell the longleaf pine. I have never gone back. I have never submitted what I saw and heard and experienced to any agency, any researcher, any journalist. Until now. Here's what I believe, for whatever an old man's beliefs are worth. That forest is larger than we imagine and older than our presence in it. There are things in it that have been here longer than the state of Florida has been a state, longer than European boots have walked that sand. They have survived by staying invisible, by being, in the assessment of one of them, careful, not hiding out of weakness, hiding out of intelligence, because they understand what human beings do to things they don't recognize. What I encountered was an apex predator with a cognitive capacity that, in the right circumstances, produces something indistinguishable from wisdom. It had tracked me, assessed me, communicated with me in my own language, offered me food, and given me a gift I did not deserve. The knowledge that it was watching over that territory, over those 47,000 acres of longleaf and cypress, with a competence and a care that no forest service district could match. I do not know if it is still alive. It showed the silver muzzle of middle age, or later in 1994. By now, 31 years, I would think not. But I believe there are others. The territory that large, managed by one male, suggests a broader population. A family somewhere in the interior. Young ones learning to be as careful as their elders. I hope no one finds them. I hope the cameras stay off and the drones stay grounded and the hikers stay on the marked trails, and the careful men of this world stay few enough and strange enough that what's left of the wild can keep its secrets. I am 68 years old. My back is bad and my knee is worse, and the doctor has said things about my heart that I choose not to repeat. I have a daughter who loves me and a granddaughter named Rosie, who is 4 years old and already fierce in ways that remind me of nobody I can name. I have 2 composition notebooks that I will leave to Claire with a letter explaining what they contain. She will know what to do. She always does. And I have a memory, not a photograph, not a recording, nothing I can show you, of a morning on a limestone bluff above a fast, shallow creek in the northeastern Ocala National Forest. The water running over the rock, the amber eyes across the water, the voice like gravel on iron, finding English words from somewhere deep in a chest built for an entirely different language. You come far. For nothing dangerous. Careful, man, I see you. Many times. I came far, and I found nothing dangerous, and I have been careful for 31 years with what I was given. I hope that was the right choice. Thank you for letting an old man set this down. It's lighter than it was.